deep, deep in the darkest areas of the internet, there is a place where Nazis live. There is a place where bad people live. There is a place where Doobie lives. Where chaos reigns supreme. Where there's little moderation, for the moderators are only focused on moderating the other moderators. In it, they call this the free marketplace of ideas. It's a dangerous place. Only the bravest go there. It is not a safe space at all. It is a bad place, a dangerous place. And I have been forced to go there and present myself as an offering. Yeah, no, I'm doing the Amy in half an hour. I need to prime myself. I need to, get myself going. Oh, Eris, you hold such a big brain. Does it ever get exhausting carrying that brain around? Yeah, it's a lot. I actually need to raise money for some extra personal training just so I can hold my huge brain. The Amy is on the politics Discord server. I don't know if someone wants to put it in the link. I'm just warning you guys, it is not a safe space, okay? It is not a safe space. It's like the opposite of safe space. Wish me luck, guys.
Okay, so I think just before we get started, Eris, can you give us like a general outline of your position on Israel-Palestine, the whole conflict?
Wait, is this Amy just going to be about Israel-Palestine?
Primarily, I think. Well, here's what I'd like. I think that you're someone who's very knowledgeable on the topic, and we don't really have a lot of knowledgeable people on that specific topic in the community. I think there's some, but no one at your level. And I think this can be a great learning experience for a lot of people in the community. Like, I think you have a lot to offer on that end. So I'd like, most questions to be about that, but we can also talk about other things, of course. So we'll take questions about everything, but I think I'd like you to educate my community, basically.
I highly doubt that. I highly doubt that I'm the most educated person here. I'm sure there are a bunch of people who are.
Well, aside from me, obviously.
Oh yeah, when I think of knowledgeable about Israel-Palestine, I think of Doobie, for sure.
Clip that, please.
Okay, but I welcome all different types of questions. It might be, if I keep getting questions on that topic, it might be a lot all at once. So feel free to put in questions that are a little easier.
Okay. So I guess
I was supposed to talk about my opinions, right?
Yep.
I guess my opinions are that number one, I believe in a two-state solution. I also think that Israel was founded on an ethnic cleansing and a lot of other problematic things that happened in 1948. That's what I personally study, is 1948. However, I also do find that people have a tendency to at least scapegoat Israel or participate in anti-Semitic tropes when they discuss their criticisms of Israel. So I try to make sure when I'm being critical of Israel that I'm really responsible with my language and being aware of avoiding those kind of tropes. And I mostly I really believe in a two-state solution. Ultimately, I'd love to get to a one-state solution, but I think that will take a lot of time to get to, especially when you think of how radicalized both populations are right now. And I don't think the situation with the Palestinians is I don't think they have time to wait. So I think the most viable thing is for them to get their own self-determination, Jews to have their own self-determination, and then slowly, as they live side by side, to eventually, form one state, as they both don't feel like they need their own self-determination. But I think that needs to happen organically. The only other, to me, the only other option right now is Israel just remaining completely in control and their own version of a one-state solution, which is obviously not okay for the Palestinians. And yeah, I think that that's probably like a broad my opinion, but we can get into the details.
Well, okay, so first question. This is from Binary Agent. The question is, do you find that the right-wing Republicans, conservatives in the U.S. often side with your views on Israel-Palestine?
No. Never. I mean, none of them would ever say that an ethnic cleansing ever happened. And I mean, there's like, I mean, I'm not American, so if I were to guess, like, the typical mainstream Republican line is like a neocon kind of line, which is always like very supportive of Israel, no matter what, and not just supportive of Israel, but very supportive of the right wing in Israel. Like they have a lot of connections with Bibi Netanyahu himself. So, and they support like his kind of lines of thinking and his structures and what he thinks being pro-Israel is, which is a very, very specific type of Zionism, right? So I don't, that's what I would say, like, about like, that's why those types of people would literally call me like a self-hating Jew, in response. So I don't think that my views like connect at all to them. My views probably are a little more similar to like a Democrat's, but I don't even know if a lot of Democrats would admit there was an ethnic cleansing in 1948. I think the thing is that like, I look at the situation with at least some nuance, and there's so many like heavy terms that people associate with this conflict, like whether it's apartheid or Holocaust or genocide or colonialism or ethnic cleansing and all of that stuff. And it feels like if you don't use all those terms, then you're kind of like not morally pure enough to be advocating for the Palestinians. At least that feels like the discourse online. But in the real world, that's not how it is. In the real world, the Overton like window is much more to the right. And those people would literally consider me like an extreme leftist by comparison. Whereas like Twitter will call me like a colonizer or something.
Yeah, I mean, so we see those terms thrown around a lot, right? Like apartheid, genocide. So you would say that this is not a genocide or apartheid? It's not an apartheid state.
Okay, so I can't say for sure if it's not a genocide, because if there's something that I've learned, like studying history, is that you never know really what a country is doing until around at least 30 years later, because of the 30-year rule in history. So, or sometimes the 20-year rule. So I can't say for sure it's not a genocide. I mean, we just found out in Canada that like they just literally found a mass grave of Indigenous youth in a residential school like graveyard, right? Or like backyard. So like, yeah, we might find something like that in the future, right? And then I'll totally eat my word. So I don't want to say like for sure this is not happening. I'm pretty sure about things when a lot of time has passed and I'm able to really go through all the primary documentation, able to get historical consensus, all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, even during the Holocaust, literally the Jews who were about to walk in the gas chambers did not know that they were being genocided. So yeah, like I don't think a genocide is going, like I haven't seen the evidence. What I do think is going on is I think that there are war crimes going on, but I don't just like, to me, like if you just start calling that genocide, you end up, the word becomes meaningless. And if Israel's actions, first of all, that means that you can call almost any form of irresponsible warfare genocide. And then on top of that, the numbers don't justify it, right? Normally during genocides, populations numbers go down. We saw that with indigenous peoples. We've been seeing that with the Uyghurs in China. So, and that's not going on right now. So to me, there's not evidence that would demonstrate to me that there is a genocide. And I would like to at least keep that term, just in case. I wouldn't put it past the Israeli government. I wouldn't put it past the Israeli government for actually doing that eventually. And so I feel like we should keep that term for if that shit ever actually does happen, so it doesn't just become like a crying wolf situation. And if that stuff, like if I start seeing like Palestinian birth rates suddenly drop, and people start going to re-education camps and all that kind of stuff, I want to be able to have that word to call out that shit so it actually gets taken seriously. And for now, I feel like there are enough terms to describe what's going on, like at least in like the latest specific situations. So I don't think you just need to like, throw a term on it that just doesn't make sense.
Okay, great answer. So we're gonna go to Miles next. Miles, you are unmuted.
Hello.
Hello.
So, my mom's knocking. Okay, pass my question. Sorry.
Okay. So his mom was in the room, I guess. Next question is going to be from Rolling Deadly. The question was, why did you never apologize for letting me hang on my birthday?
I think I did say sorry. I'm pretty sure that like I slept through it accidentally. So I don't have a good track record with birthdays. So I don't know. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I know all about that, Rolling. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry. Next question, please.
Okay. Next question from Zippo. Would you consider the Gaza Strip and West Bank de facto annexed?
Annexed?
Mm-hmm.
No. I mean, I'm trying to think, like, the legal definition, it depends on what you consider annex, right? Like, when I think of the term annexed, I think of, like, completely absorbing the land within your own land and turning it from a temporary occupation into a permanent part of your country, right? Am I wrong on that?
So you'd still call that territory like occupied and not like fully incorporated into like
It's
Israel.
Not even technically occupied. So the West Bank is occupied, but Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. That's how like Hamas could take so much control, and that's how they're able to even like launch rockets from the area. If they were under occupation, like a military occupation wouldn't allow rockets to be shot off. So they're not actually under military occupation. What they are under is it's basically like an open air prison. So they're kept in from the south by Egypt, and from the north and from the east they're kept in by Israel. So the consequence of that is that like their water supply, their their food supply, like all of that kind of stuff, even just getting humanitarian help, all of that stuff can just be cut off by Israel in an instant, and Israel does that all the time. So they're very under control from that kind of perspective, but it's not like technically a military occupation. So I would call it like, there's another term to be used. I'm trying to think of the word, more like blockades and stuff. And obviously they're under, like, especially when conflicts like this come up, constant bombardment. And then because they're Palestinians and they're not considered equal Israeli citizens, they have to go through regular checkpoints and everything if they want to get into other zones and all that stuff.
Okay. Next question is from Lewis Inho. That question is, who do you believe is morally in the wrong in this conflict?
It depends on I would have to know the specific situation. So if we were to talk like the most recent flare-up, I would say Israel. So, I mean, obviously, I think Hamas is a disgusting organization, and I hate them. But ironically, like, it was, Israel that would refuse a ceasefire. And they refused a ceasefire for a long period of time, probably because the government had always planned to take out Hamas to this level. They'd already had this plan, and they just kind of wanted an excuse to go forth with it. And that's why they didn't agree to the ceasefire. It's not that they didn't want to end. I mean, Israelis were fucking terrified. They were constantly running to their bomb shelters and stuff. So it wasn't like Israelis didn't want a ceasefire. But the government wasn't going to agree to it until they got their plan done, which was taking out certain Hamas operatives with little care if civilians got killed. So, yeah. So, like, in that situation, I'd say that they're pretty pretty abhorrent, but I don't know. Hamas is also pretty fucking abhorrent. But if you're talking about like the overall conflict, I would say neither. If I think that this is a story of like two historically oppressed groups who are both like indigenous to the area, fighting over land because of huge like mistakes being done by the European colonial powers that were in control of it, whether it was Turkey, from like Turkey to the Ottoman Empire to like the British Empire. The British Empire particularly has a lot of responsibility for the conflict because they promised the Arabs their own state. Back then, Palestinians weren't really necessarily called Palestinians; they're called Arabs, and because Israelis were called Palestinians too, so it'd be useless for me to call them Palestinians right now. So they offered the Arabs their own state, which is why the Arabs rejected the UN partition in 1947. And they also offered Jews their own state, and both those states couldn't work. Like they were counter promises, so they were just like constant false promises. They gave zero fucks about the stability in the region, or peace between different groups. They were just temporarily, satisfying them. It's like when you're like giving people like little bones, like because you don't even respect them, you're just trying to help them get off your back. And so I actually think the British Empire and the UK has a lot of, probably the most responsibility in this entire conflict. There are other things that make things worse, and especially once the Israel started to what's the word that I'm looking for? They started to woo the religious right, the Jewish religious right, and woo them into the Zionist movement. Originally, they weren't. That also caused a bunch of problems that I think has made things a lot worse. Hamas coming up in the 1980s made things significantly worse as well. So the thing is that right now Israel is the one with the power. So while I think like morally, I don't think like either is necessarily like fully more guilty than the other. Israel has actually much more power to make a change, and so should naturally be held to a higher standard.
Okay. Next question is going to be from Global Warming Skeptic, who I am unmuting now. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, what do you think about Palestinian oppression of religious minorities, and gender inequality and homophobia, extreme cases in these instances where these groups are literally fleeing to their arch enemy Israel to avoid this oppression? And, it's going to sound controversial, but this is the way I asked it. Like, do you think that these groups would be better off in a greater Israel where they just control the entire Levant area?
The only way that, like, they're trading one oppression for another oppression. So I agree that the way LGBT people get treated within the Palestinian like government structure and within that culture is pretty abhorrent. They recently, they actually regularly assassinate and like kill Hamas leaders if they get discovered to be quote unquote homosexual, and then they just shoot them. And I don't know, it's weird that leftists don't give a shit about that stuff when that's going on. I've obviously like the way women get treated in certain areas. Like I totally understand that, the Palestinians are not exactly like very westernized in that sense. The thing is that if they were to live in, say, Greater Israel, the only way Greater Israel could remain a Jewish state, which is basically a requirement, whether I like it or not, it's like 100%, it's gonna stay there right now. It's gonna stay as a Jewish state, as long as Jews are terrified of anti-Semitism. So in order for it to remain as a Jewish state, it would, and to still remain a democracy, like the only way would be to make Arabs second-class citizens, and so to literally create an apartheid-like system. So I don't think Greater Israel is like a good solution to that problem, because I think it'll just make the apartheid claims real.
Well, don't you think that calling it apartheid is a little bit extreme, given how apartheid actually was? Like we're
I would
talking about,
say it's extreme right now, but I don't think it's, to me, if you're gonna make one racial group automatically second citizen, so like if to keep Israel a democracy and a Jewish state, in a situation where Jews are potentially a minority, the only way to do that is through an apartheid system where, and I don't have to use the term apartheid, but that's literally what it is, where where Arabs literally wouldn't be allowed to vote. That would be the only solution.
Well, I think you're making a bit extreme of claims regarding Israel even today. Like there is discrimination against Palestinians, but to call it apartheid is super way extreme. We're talking about people who are just, it's mostly for security purposes, right? They're not being denied basic services as what was apartheid and given inferior services.
Well, I don't think it's apartheid. Maybe you misheard me, but I don't think it's apartheid right now. I think it could become apartheid if the Palestinians don't get their own state, and Israel just ends up settling the entire region with settlers, and creating a quote unquote greater Israel in terms of the land. If Palestinians don't get their own state, the only other solution is apartheid.
Well, I guess we can move on from this because I don't want to take up your entire time, but I'd like you to, within this AMA, at least substantiate that claim that Israel would be apartheid in a greater Israel system. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Mr. Skeptic. So maybe could you expand on that a little more? Because I think I know what you're getting at. You're saying that it isn't currently apartheid, but if Israel took over the entire area, given the demographics of the area, they would probably institute some kind of apartheid system to keep the Palestinian...
Yeah, especially Palestinians would probably expect a right to return, right? So,
exactly.
The minute that happens, Israel, Jews are going to become a minority in the region. So you can only... And if Jews want to live in a democratic state, the only way that it can remain a Jewish state with a Jewish minority is an apartheid system. That's what apartheid was in South Africa, where whites were a minority, and they were governing, and black people were not allowed to vote.
Right. Yeah. So.
Yeah, will it have all the intricacies of apartheid, where there's going to be a bench that says no Arabs or something? I don't know. But at least the basics of that entire different racial class, or not racial, but at least class system, it would exist.
Yeah. Okay. That seems pretty clearly laid out to me. Next question. This is from Duckers, Dr. Z, who I think is from your chat. It says, stupid question. How does Hamas manage to get missiles into Gaza?
Oh, yeah, this is not something I'm very knowledgeable on. From to my knowledge, they get them through. So Hamas has built these tunnels that they on the outside say is for pushing through medical care and other kind of humanitarian needs, but they also, and they probably use it for that as well, because Israel does often block humanitarian things, but then they also use it to transport weapons and missiles and stuff. They also probably transport the materials and then build them there. So I'm not a super expert though on how I'm not sure about the intricacies of how they really get it in and where they get it from and all of that stuff. Though Hamas is known to use charities as a front for their funding.
Okay. Next question is from Deniability. And this is, I don't know much about the ethnic cleansing claims. I would be interested to hear a summary from Eris on Israel being founded on ethnic cleansing.
Okay. I went into this on my stream, I think last week, where I went into the details of the Nakba. The Nakba means the Great Catastrophe, which is kind of what 1947, 1948 was for Palestinians. So there are only 6 out of how many? I'm trying to remember how many villages, off the top of my head. I think there are 240 something villages.
Yeah, it was like 200 and something.
Yeah. And out of all those villages, only 6 left on their own accord. So we have records of at least 9 of them where they were deliberately, literally, like, just kicked out. We have the official Israeli orders. I showed them on my stream. I mean, they're out. They've been out since 1978. Anyone can go read them if you can understand Hebrew, or you can read a translation. So those happen in those villages. Then in the majority of villages, what happened is that they would hear about war crimes that would happen in nearby villages. And when those war crimes would happen, and I'm telling you, like, really gruesome stuff, including like rape, murder, torture, vile shit, right? When they would hear about those things going on, they would leave. They would pack their bags and leave. And they expected to be able to come back, in a few weeks, a few months, or something like that. And obviously they never could. Though just to preface it though, like, war crimes were happening on the Arab side because the Arab countries who were at war with Israel were also committing genocides. Like, there was a huge genocide in Hebron. There's no Jews in Hebron anymore. They ethnically cleansed them out of the region as well. So yeah, there's like, it's happened. It basically, ethnic cleansing was going on as a whole. The problem is the people who were committing the ethnic cleansing to Jews were the neighboring Arab countries, and not necessarily the Palestinians themselves. So it's like, they're kind of like paying for a crime that they didn't really commit.
Okay. So the next question is gonna be from not DiCaprio, who I think is DiCaprio. It says, a complicated question. What is your version of the Palestinian state? Should they control the airspace, have a conventional level of sovereignty, have an army, Jerusalem as a shared capital? If you said no to one of these, is it really a state? If you say yes to everything, your position is way beyond what the left Israeli political party is willing to accept, or what Ehud Barak offered to Arafat. So what make you think this is even possible?
I think what Ehud Barak offered to Arafat was a very, very fair offer, and I know the Palestinians would accept that deal today. Like, if you show that offer to modern Palestinians and to Mahmoud Abbas today, they would accept it today. The Israelis will not offer that today, because Israelis have become very, very, very radicalized since the Second Intifada and the Palat of Gaza. So, I mean, to say, like, is something really a state if you don't have an army? Like, tons of states have not had militaries for a certain amount of time in order to build trust. And, like, this whole all or nothing kind of thing, it feels like it comes from a place of privilege, because you have to understand, like, right now, Palestinians are literally living under, like, some of, like, the most vile situations. In the West Bank, they barely have enough water to bathe and take care of themselves. They're constantly subject to, in East Jerusalem, they're literally being kicked out of their homes. In Gaza, they're just being bombed constantly. Like, I'm pretty sure they would be pretty grateful to just have their own self-determination and not be under an Israeli boot. Even if that meant, minor sacrifices, like, and not having, like, all the exact same things every other state has, like its own military and stuff. That stuff you can always move towards getting there. But to me, the most important thing is, like, a viable solution that's going to directly start helping Palestinians as soon as possible. So I don't think this whole, like, all or nothing approach it's healthy, and I actually think it's really detrimental to the peace process.
Okay. Next question is from Miles. Miles, hope you're ready this time.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about last time.
That's okay.
So I live in an East Coast city. I live in New York City, and we have a large community of Hasidic Jews who live in various communities in different neighborhoods. My family personally is very liberal Jewish, as are my friends. So when I talk to my friends and my family about Hasidic Jews, constantly they say negative things. They are kind of bash on them, and they kind of just talk about how they struggle with them in the community. And personally, when when I visit Hasidic communities, they don't wear masks, among within like the current COVID climate. And so, even though this is kind of like a detour from the Israel-Palestine conflict, what I wanted to ask is, do you think that Hasidic Jews as communities, is it more important to respect their rights and their autonomy to exist as a community? Because historically they've been marginalized, and maybe it's important to like respect their ability to function autonomously as a community, as part of their culture. Is it more important to respect that, or should we try and prioritize rule of law, and should we try and find new ways to not like enforce law, but like to communicate with these communities on like, okay, here's how you have to follow these policies within our environment, within our cities.
I'm actually really, really passionate about this. I wasn't Hasidic, but I was briefly like Haredi, so it was like just like a different sect. And I lived under those circumstances as a woman, and even though it was also in New York, so even though it was like in New York and in this, like super westernized country, they lived in their entire, like when you're in there, it's its own universe. And like it is very, very, very oppressive. So I understand that historically, they've been oppressed, right? But secular Jews get oppressed as well. And that doesn't mean that just because you get oppressed doesn't mean that you have the right to oppress others. And that is exactly what they do within their own community. They are incredibly vile to women. I witnessed people being forced to marry their rapists. I witnessed some incredibly awful things. I mean, in a lot of those Hasidic communities, particularly, girls are not even allowed to get a proper education. They don't even learn how to count, which I feel like is a form of abuse. They're not even taught how to speak English. And this way it makes them completely dependent on the community, and they can't ever leave their abusive husbands or anything like that. Additionally, in Orthodox Judaism, a woman is not allowed to leave her husband without the explicit permission of the husband, where I'm sure you know this, where he needs to agree to a quote unquote get, and that is also a really awful system. And I think it's really shitty, because I remember being in there and thinking how does the United States let this happen? They complain about what's going on with the Taliban in Afghanistan, yet the shit is going on right here. The shit and that's just how women were treated. I can't even imagine how trans people or gay people and stuff were treated as well. Or even just a guy that doesn't want to follow the typical stuff. The things that are allowed in those communities is just absolutely vile. I think rule of law should be the most important thing, not for the sake of oppressing them, but to actually prevent them from oppressing their own, because that's literally what's going on here. And the way they literally treat women like baby-making slaves, and it's pretty gross. Not all communities are equal in this, but especially some of those Hasidic communities that you mentioned, I could get in, there's details like the Satmar and stuff that are really, really gross, and I think that should be, I don't know, I think that should be taken seriously. And the whole thing with the COVID thing was very, very weird, but I don't know.
Yeah, do you think how would you counter the argument that this is our culture, this is how we lived, and it's important for us to exist like this because this is part of who we are? How do you argue or give a counterpoint to that?
I mean, Jewish law wise, I don't think it makes too much sense, because a lot of their habits are cultural and not actually religious. So for example, they force women to cover their hair. I mean, and it's from a passage in the Torah where it says, where they threw off a woman's head covering to show her shame as an idolater. So they interpreted that as any woman that is not an adulterer should be covering her hair if she's married. But tons of Jewish scholars and Halacha scholars have determined that's not necessarily required, or you could be wearing a hat or something like that. I mean, you could put like a pin and it would technically justify it. I mean, the way they dress with like, you know, the long suits and all that stuff, none of those things are technically in like, it's just, it comes from like their culture historically. And it's fine if they want to dress that way, that's totally chill, but you shouldn't be allowed to get away with the things that they get away with. And the reason why they do is because they create huge voting blocks. Because as I mentioned, a lot of these communities purposely keep their communities uneducated. By not understanding how to speak and read English, by not learning how to do basic math and all that stuff, they become very, very reliant on their rabbis. They call them like their rebbes. So they'll do anything that their rebbe says. So, for example, in Israel, for Israel the government of Israel to get everyone vaccinated, they literally had to go to the rebbes and convince the rebbes to agree to get their communities vaccinated. Like the rebbes are like the kings in this world. And so politicians kind of like Orthodox, like, you know, the Hasidic communities in New York, because they're a great way to guarantee a vote. Because like in what community can you literally just go to like one or two people and you get their approval and then they'd be like, okay, I'm providing you thousands of votes just automatically. So I don't know if that's ever going to change because there's such a problematic like incentive system there for people to just like satisfy whatever a Rebbe wants because of the votes he can bring. There's a saying in New York, like no one can bring in votes like a Rebbe. But luckily it's just a New York problem. I don't think it's a big problem in other places, maybe a little in London.
Damn. Well, thank you. That was very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Oh.
Thank you, Miles. Next question. This is getting away from Israel-Palestine for a second. The question is, do you have any tips on debating Holocaust deniers?
I have a document that I kind of share, and I know Doobie, you share it sometimes on politics.
Yep.
With I guess some of the number one things. I always think going to primary documentation is the best thing to do. They won't accept any witness testimony because they'll just like, you know, shove it to the side as just being like Jews. And if you bring up witness testimony of Nazis and it's like, oh, they're just being funded by Jews. So that could be very, very frustrating. So like primary documents, especially like, you know, the German documentation is probably your best bet. But I mean, overall, the majority of Holocaust deniers that I've met, I used to think that Holocaust deniers were just people who were, you know, skeptical of a historical event and they just wanted proof and they'd gotten some propaganda and you just needed to give them counterproof. But so often when I would debate Holocaust deniers, and I really felt like I argued incredibly effectively, I gave them tons of evidence, there was just like no proper refuting, but so often it would just turn out they'd actually already knew that it happened. And you're probably like, whoa, that's so strange. But it happened like a bunch of times where, they would just, eventually once I did all the things that they said people couldn't do, like I fully proved that it happened, they would just go, oh, well, I really don't give a shit. And it turned out they always knew. So, and that they came at it really from bad faith. You have to understand that in order to deny a historical event, like we don't actually have as much proof, like our proof for the Holocaust is so much. We have more proof of the Holocaust than most historical events in history. So in order to deny any aspect of the Holocaust, and that's what denial is, like, you know, saying that it's less than 6 million, saying that it's, saying that Hitler wasn't particularly in control of it, saying that there wasn't gas chambers, etc. Any part of that denial requires, because there's so much historical consensus, because there's so much evidence to go through and it's so readily available to anyone online, in order to deny it, you have to already be coming at it with a preconceived kind of presupposition, which is that there is a conspiracy. And that conspiracy, like, to cover that up. That's the only logical reason why there would be all this evidence and the evidence doesn't mean anything. You would need a conspiracy, and that's where you start getting into anti-Semitic territory. So it's one of the reasons why historians as a whole really reject debating Holocaust deniers, and I started to understand why they don't. because they don't think it's like they don't mind having like, disagreements on details within the Holocaust. Like, did Goring's, statement here impact this thing and on this train and all that stuff. But debating like the overall things that everyone accepts, people just know that you're already coming at it from such bad faith because of that conspiratorial angle that they're like not even worth your time. It's like they just know you're a troll. So that's one of the reasons why I've just gotten exhausted debating them. And I got a bit doomer-pilled on them, especially with that event. I think I was in politics, where someone, there was a Holocaust denier doing an AMA, and he brought up, a false historian named David Irving, who's a really infamous Holocaust denier. I kind of destroyed him on it. I challenged him to a debate. He wanted to do a debate. He agreed. He did all this posturing in public and said, "Oh, of course I'll debate you, blah, blah, blah. I'd love to." Right. And then in private, he literally told me, I give zero fucks whether or not 6 million died, and I don't want to debate you. So it's this is all propaganda for them. It's all and so I've just kind of become super doomer pilled on that shit. So if I were you, I wouldn't even bother. But if you want to be a champ, I would just go for those primary documents.
Yeah, I'll post those up later for you guys. But yeah, I was actually the one trying to set up that debate between the two of them. And yeah, in the group DM, he just straight up said he doesn't care if it happened. But in public, he was calling her honey and sweetheart and doing all this stupid posturing. But as soon as we got out of public, he just didn't want the debate at all. Just didn't even care. So yeah, it was really stupid. Next question is from Spectre. Spectre, I think, has 2 questions. Spectre, you're unmuted.
Yeah, one moment.
Okay.
So one of my questions was, what are your thoughts on Israel's nuclear program? Do you believe that it promotes instability within a region, or do you believe that it is justified for self-defense?
I mean, I don't think any nuclear weapons are justified, right? So I would say I'm against, as a whole, nuclear weapons, which I don't feel like it's a very controversial take. But I understand from Israel's perspective, because of how small of a minority Jews are, and how Jews tend to feel, there's a pattern if you look at anti-Semitism in history, where Jews feel comfortable, they assimilate, they get quote unquote considered the mainstream, and then they always get kind of canceled or something, again, and then the anti-Semitism just picks up, right? When Hitler, just before Hitler started becoming popular, Jews were doing incredibly well in Germany. They were probably the most successful in Germany. So I understand, especially if you're Jewish and you've been raised with that kind of knowledge of that pattern in your history, you're gonna feel very mistrustful of the world, in the non-Jewish world. So it would make sense from their perspective, if other people have nukes, they want their own.
Do you believe that it makes it more difficult to reach an agreement with Iran on their nuclear program? Given
I don't
that
know.
we support
I never
Israel?
thought about that before. I would have to say that I don't know the answer to that one. I do think it makes it more difficult to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, Israel can just do what it wants because it has nukes. And that's that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Next question is from Anime King, unfortunately. And he's been nagging me to ask this question for the last 30 minutes. The question is, who invented hummus?
That's such a political question.
Please share your opinion on the International Men's Day Straight Pride.
Okay, so the thing about hummus is, I'm not going to answer this question. But this is the one we'll get him canceled. No one really knows who invented hummus. It's definitely originally Arabic, but who knows what it was before the Arab invasion. So who knows?
Okay, so a less controversial political question from another user called Delish. Was Hamas created by Israel? because Israel attacks on Gaza and blocking human living materials just like electricity and water. People start losing their family members and they lost hope, so their only reason is to fight back, ? So they're asking if Israel created Hamas, and also if these actions contribute to some Palestinians supporting Hamas.
Okay. There's two questions in there. There are like two potential answers depending on what you but depending on what was asked, so I guess I'll just answer both. In terms of, it's really important when you're looking at Hamas to not frame Hamas as quote unquote fighting back. And it's been very worrisome when I've seen people on the left use that kind of language to either justify Hamas or apologize for Hamas or anything like that. Because Hamas doesn't quote unquote fight back. If it fought back, it would be targeting IDF soldiers with its rockets. It would be doing suicide bombs into military zones. It would it would be doing targeted assassinations on members of the IDF or the Israeli government. Things like that. For example, even if you look at like a bunch of other groups that have historically fought back or like rebelled, that's the difference between like rebellions and terrorism. So Hamas deliberately targets Israeli civilians because it is genocidal in its intention for the region. It wants to clear out all Jews from the river to the sea by their own mantra. If you look at their actual charter, they are like anti-Semitic in their entire ideological structure. And they literally are also, they want to establish an ethno-state. So if you're angry at Israel because of an ethno-state thing, they want to create their own ethno-state, and like an Arab supremacist state. It's in their mantra. And on top of that, not just an Arab supremacist state, but a Muslim supremacist state, a Sunni supremacist state, where they literally, where they mistreat because not all Palestinians are Sunni Muslims. Some are Shiites, some are Christian, some are Bedouins. Like some are Druze. Like there are lots of different types, and they all get oppressed by Hamas. So Hamas is not fighting back, for Palestinians, because it's literally trying to create terror amongst Israel in order to further its political and genocidal aims. And all it does, and the effect of it, and it knows it kind of does this, right? Because the entire effect is that whenever they send one of those rockets targeting to some civilians, it just makes Israelis more radicalized. When Israelis are more radicalized, they're more likely to vote right wing and vote for Netanyahu. When Netanyahu and Likud are in power, they're more likely to build more settlements. You build more settlements, you radicalize Palestinians. Palestinians are more likely to vote for Hamas. So it's actually in Hamas's interest for their own survival against Fatah, because they're going through, like, Hamas are not the only government for Palestinians. There's also Fatah. So like it's in their own interest because they're thinking about their own political incentives. They don't necessarily represent Palestinians as a whole. So it's in their own survival interest to literally be radicalizing Israelis more, so they in turn radicalize Palestinians and continue to vote for them. And this way, they could potentially become dominant in the West Bank and stay dominant in Gaza. So I would say, you don't want to frame it as fighting back, because that's not what they're doing. I don't think that a lot of people, I wouldn't in theory have any issue with with them defending them, Palestinians defending themselves. It's just the matter, having war crimes committed against you or being oppressed is not an excuse to commit other war crimes against other people. It's not okay. A lot of Arabs and a lot of Palestinians actually got killed by those rockets themselves because they're indiscriminate. They just target civilians. So it's that should just always be not okay, and we should always reserve a special word to describe that type of war crime. If you're talking about did Israel fund or like create Hamas. I guess like originally Hamas was created by was founded from the Muslim Brotherhood, and Israel did briefly fund and support it because at the time Fatah used to be the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it saw the PLO as its biggest enemy with Yasser Arafat, because at the time the PLO was participating in terrorism and a bunch of things. So they, it's just like a strategic thing that when you try to get you try to get your enemy to have infighting and fight with one another. And then obviously now the PLO has reformed significantly and is now a legitimate government. But Hamas remains the, one of the biggest obstacles to peace. I don't know if that answers the question. But
I think it did. Next question is going to be from Peter. Peter, you are unmuted.
Let me see. Am I on? Is it working?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I had to accept it last time. First off, Eris, thank you so much for doing this. This is awesome and endlessly fascinating as a topic. My question is specifically about American international aid and the UN protections that the US are giving to Israel actively. What role do you think, because you see people, I think, arguing from each side that American support is either very important to Israel or that it's more or less insubstantial to its relationship to the Palestinian state. How important do you really think politically that American aid and protection is to Israel?
I think it is pretty important. I'm trying to remember the exact number, but I'm pretty sure it's a third of like their entire spending. It's a third or a fifth, I can't remember. Obviously, those two numbers mean something very different. But it is considered significant, though there is a huge movement within Israel, and I know Israel is slowly working towards trying to be more independent of the United States. It wasn't always dependent on the United States. It used to be, but it's always been dependent on other groups for help. For example, in the 1948 war, they actually got a lot of help from Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. And Russia initially used to help them a lot. But then during the Cold War, America swooped in and then grabbed them because they were all fighting over, who was going to come on their side. So, I don't know. I don't think it would be I would say it's a medium, like, impact, right? Where I do think it would be detrimental to Israel, particularly the main thing that, the main thing that the funding gets used for, I think, is for the Iron Dome, because the Iron Dome's incredibly expensive. But yeah, there is a huge movement in Israel to want to get rid of funding anyways. But I do think that because the United States funds Israel, it actually means that the United States has much more power in trying to fix a situation, and probably why they have more power than almost any other diplomatic entity to be able to, change what's going on. So I feel like that can be used to their advantage. But I'm not American, so I can't say if I'm pro-funding Israel or not. I just know that American diplomacy is not, and who they fund is not based off of morals, because they support Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. It's probably just what's strategically important for them.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next question is from someone from your chat, actually. Marcus Schilius. Whenever you're ready, Marcus, you're unmuted.
Hey, well, Eris, I was going to ask about pencil dicks, but I'll make it a bit more serious, this question. So being British and knowing the general involvement of the Empire regarding Israel-Palestine historically, I'm interested in what you think the wider global community could or should do to aid the situation.
I think just bringing more attention to it helps. But then on the other hand, I also feel like there's a side effect when you bring, I guess, undue attention to it compared to other, because it's still a very small conflict and it's a small region compared to the rest of the world. It does often make Jews feel very targeted, and if Jews feel more targeted, they're not going to respond. It's not going to help Palestinians out. So I guess the things that I focus on for me is I focus on trying to talk to Israelis and talking to other people in the Jewish community, and to get them to empathize. Especially, a lot of them don't know the history of what happened to Palestinians in 1948. They only know about the ethnic cleansing of Jews, and they don't know about what happened to Palestinians, like, historically. I think that will really help with, like, empathy. In terms of, like, diplomacy and international relations, I have absolutely no clue. What I do know does not help is, like, UN resolutions or like the BDS movement. All it does is it just further radicalizes Israelis, and makes them feel more and more like Israel is a representative of Jews as a whole, and that the world is just anti-Semitic. So I don't think that those methods are very effective. But yeah, it's hard to say. I would have to think about, like, the best way, but I think the United States is uniquely positioned, and I could say that as a non-American, is uniquely positioned to have a huge impact on diplomacy, like, in the region, and pressuring Israel to do things more than the British.
Great. Cartoon rights, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yes, cartoon rights.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we've gotten, like, I've seen like 4 or 5 questions along the same lines. Basically, some of them are asking, like, what do you think about the Jews using their religion to justify colonizing an area? Others are saying, like, what gives them the right to be there? Others are asking, how is it not a colonialist state? So can you just kind of get into that and explain, I guess the formation of Israel in 2 minutes?
Yeah, that's a lot of...
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a way you could be more specific with a question?
Okay, so there's a misconception, I think. I've heard this on your stream before, right? About Israel.
Do you want to talk about... Wait, okay. There was an initial question I just remembered about...
Sure.
Judaism being used as a way to justify Israel's existence?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's, like, a misconception. Judaism was never originally a way to justify Israel's existence. Jews were there historically. It's not like something made by a fancy sky god. I don't believe in any of the shit that was in the Bible. But like, historically, Jews were in the region. Jews are called Jews because they come from Judea, and Judea is in Palestine. So they were there, like, they were there originally. The question is like, obviously it was some time ago. I think they were kicked out by the Romans in the year, like, 480 or something, 380, something like that. So it would be like the equivalent of, say, like, the indigenous people of the Americas kind of being kicked out. They were sent on slave ships to, say, like, Italy, because that's what happened to Jews. And then about 1,000 years later, they want to come back, and now white people have settled there, or other groups have settled there, or maybe some people who have mixed genetics with some indigenous genetics and all of that stuff. So it's a little different, and you don't want to paint it with, like, the same brush as, say, like, colonialism. And most academics agree with that. The thing that people would use would be, like, settler colonialism, and I still kind of disagree with that definition. But yeah, Judaism is not actually used as a way to justify Israel's existence historically. Modern wise, you can see it sometimes, especially, like, I'd say Christianity justifies it a lot with, like, the Republicans and the right wing. But like, in terms of Jewish law and halakha, the majority of very religious Jews were against the formation of Zionism, and they were against the forming of an Israeli state, because at the end, I think it's Leviticus, at the end of Leviticus, when it talks about Israel, in the Messiah coming, it literally says that Jews have to wait for the Messiah to come, and then Israel is going to be formed, right? So Jews were large. So Zionism originally was a very secular movement. It was a very lefty kind of movement, and it was a very young movement. And it was kind of about, like, in humanists, like, it's about, like, young people kind of, there was this old idea within Jewish circles because of that line. And if you look at the the Torah, right, or the Old Testament, it's like kind of like the story of like a very abusive relationship, right? Like God does something, like the Jews like did something, you know, a little bit bad, like maybe they worshipped a little golden calf or something, and then God punishes them. Jews do something bad, God punishes them. Like it's just this constant, and it's Jews always trying to make God happy, and then God's never happy, and he's always punishing them. And that kind of culture really embedded itself in Jewish diaspora culture. Throughout the world, whether it was Ashkenazi Jewish culture or a Sephardic Jewish culture or a Mizrahi Jewish culture, where it was like this kind of like self-hate mode of whenever bad things happened to us, we deserved it, right? Like, you know, we did something, God, so if a pogrom happened here and your family was killed, it was probably because you were eating pork. You ate pork on Friday, right? Something like that. And Zionism was as a whole about like rejecting those religious notions and kind of saying, no, we're tired of waiting for this God who's just abused us to save us, right? We're gonna save ourselves. And that's like as a whole, like the majority of Twitter leftists would probably be Zionists, right? Like originally. It's just like, you know, they didn't really think about the people who were living there at the time. That wasn't really in their mind. Trauma tends to make people a little selfish as a survival mechanism, and they weren't thinking about the consequences for the people there. So, and additionally, with colonialism, you also, they don't regard it as coming back home. Jews as a whole regard the region as coming back home, and it's not for religious reasons, it's for historical reasons, like in national reasons. I think the majority of Jews are still secular in Israel, and the majority of Zionists still are secular. And yeah, it makes no sense to me to call it colonialism. I think the only thing that I could buy is at least like settlers, like settler colonialism is building settlements in the illegal territories, because that's being, you know, agreed upon in a peace deal, in the Oslo Accords and all of that stuff, and it's known to be very detrimental now to the Palestinians. But I don't know, I'd have to, like, the colonialism thing, it's a semantic debate really about like the definition of colonialism, and all of that stuff, because like when I think of colonialism, I think of say like what the Belgians did to the Congo, where you had like a foreign strong power going into a smaller region that is, say, like less economically advanced or something like that, in order to economically extract all the resources and completely take advantage financially, like of this, like economically of the region, and you know, and colonize it with, you know, temporarily, and really just to obliterate the region. So I don't think of a bunch of refugees who are trying to find like a home, and then do it in a really problematic way, because in a way that's the story of most nations. Almost all nations I can think of were built at least a bit on an ethnic cleansing. So while I do think that the start of Israel is very problematic, I don't think it's all that different than most like national histories. I mean, yeah, like the United States is a bad example because obviously that's colonialism. But even if you look at the United Kingdom and the, you know, British history, or you look at French history or Chinese history, you know, like the whole concept of creating borders in a nation state and stuff, it's always going to create some kind of ethnic cleansing. So it's why Chomsky is, you know, doesn't believe in borders, because he's consistent with that shit.
Okay. Next question is from Kenny. Kenny, you are unmuted.
All right. I did have two questions, but I think you mostly answered the first one already. I was going to ask if you can justify the existence of Israel, and I think you've done that pretty well already. So I'll ask, can you justify the existence of Palestine, since Israel is moving in and kind of colonizing the entire place? Why should they exist if Israel is there to take over?
Oh man, that's a hard question. Okay, the biggest way is that I, like, first of all, I don't know how to justify any nation states as a whole. I'm not like a political theorist or anything like that. That's like beyond my intellectual capabilities. And I think the whole concept of nation states has a bunch of problems associated with it. But so I guess the most I can do is I can justify why they should have their own state as much as anyone else. And the reason why I could say that is that Palestinians as a whole, and the reason why there's so many Palestinian refugees, there were originally 700,000 Palestinian refugees. They're now in the, like, literally in the millions. And the reason for that, and it's very rare that refugees last for such a long period of time, like since 1948. We've had those refugees, and they still are refugees to this day, is because they usually haven't been accepted into most countries. In Jordan, they were massacred in Black September. They get discriminated against and treated as second-class citizens in Syria, in Jordan. Egypt is notoriously terrible to the Palestinians. There's an old idea within Zionist circles that, like, they see Arabs as this kind of like one monolith group, and they think, oh, like, well, Arabs get, Egypt, they get Jordan, they get Lebanon, they get like all these countries, right? Why can't we just have one? But it's simplifying, the intricate relationships between all these different Arab nation states, right? As we know, Jordan wasn't always fighting for other Arab nation states. It kind of only gives a shit about itself. And Palestinians can't just go into another Arab state and just automatically get along because they have a unique oppression, they have a unique story, and a unique nation because of that. And if anyone should understand that, it's, Jews, right? Because we've experienced something so similar. So to me, like, if anyone deserves like a state, like, it's a very similar story to Jews, right? Like, where they're getting oppressed wherever they go, and they don't manage to be treated as equal citizens. So it makes sense for them to have their own kind of self-determination. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, like, I was more thinking, like, if you could justify it from, like, a historical perspective, like, from where the origins of it were, like, the country, like, breaking out of the mold of, like, whatever conflicts they might have been in before.
Well, the people who are considered Palestinians to this day, like, today, we don't really know, like, who they are technically, genetically, or anything like that, because you have to understand that the region of Palestine has always been at the crossroads of, like, human culture, just like geographically on the map. It's like in the middle of a bunch of trade routes and all that stuff. So it's always been under control of various empires from the Canaanites, or like the Israelis, to the Israelites, to the Romans, to the Byzantines, to like the Ottomans, to the British. Like, they're always like this region's always been under control, and there's so many people that have gone in and out and in and out. Like, the Greeks were there for a long time too. So the people who are there as a whole, Jewish Palestinians, people who were originally Jewish Palestinians too, are kind of like an amalgamation, probably genetically, of a bunch of those groups, like on top of the Arab invasions and all that stuff. So the region originally was called, the oldest, I think, record we have of it is being called Canaan, like in ancient history. And I think there's a lot of historical consensus that Jews were, I'm going to upset some Jewish religious people here, but that Jews are, like, historically actually the same group as Canaanites, like they came out of the Canaanites rather than being like a foreign group. And on top of that, like, the region was called Israel. It got divided during the Israeli kingdom between Israel and Judea. Judah was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and there was like some infighting. They had a civil war, so they divided into like top Israel, Judah. And then overall, the whole region eventually gets called Judah. And when the Romans take over, they really, really hate Jews because Jews are causing them a lot of problem. They're rebelling a lot, and all of that stuff because they're under occupation. And so to kind of stick the knife in, the Romans decided to call the area Palestine. And they called it Palestine after the Philistines, which were like the historical enemies of the Israelites. So yeah, it's like, so that's like how the name came about. And I guess why, like, you'll hear some Zionists say, oh, they're like an invented people. But it's like, if you say that they're an invented people, that's like saying that, I mean, that's literally like, you could say like the British are like an invented people, right? You know, because the English came from the Anglo-Saxons and all that stuff. Like, there's as much of people as anyone else is. So I don't know if that, like, I don't know, like, if that justifies it. It's a hard thing. I don't think like history ever necessarily justifies this stuff. The idea that people just inherently have a right to land is, I think, a kind of problematic idea. And it's an idea I hear from both right wingers and leftists. Like, I hear a lot of leftists like saying it about people. Like, I'll sometimes meet someone that's indigenous, and they'll literally like this happened to me once, where I met someone who was an indigenous Canadian, and they literally said, like, welcome to my land, right? Like, it was like Canada belonged to them and not me, because I'm an immigrant. And while I understand like indigenous anger and all that stuff, like, yeah, this idea that people can just inherently own land because of like their ancestry and stuff is, yeah, it's kind of a weird one to me, that I feel like it's like an outdated concept. I feel like we should get away from that.
Kenny?
Yeah, all right. I think you answered my questions, but I'll do a follow-up real quick then. Kind of what you ended on. Do you think that Israel is then mostly justified in their actions because they have the means to back up their claims of land?
Wait, the means? When I hear means,
so
I think about like the
basically-
power, not.
Yes, exactly. So, right, when you talk about Canada, the people who colonized Canada, they were backed up by the British, right? They had the means to take over the land from the indigenous people. Same, basically, in Israel. Israel is backed by America massively, and has a massive amount of firepower behind them, right? So they have the means to take the land from the indigenous people, just like in Canada. Is that
I wouldn't say
then
it's just like
justified in your
that.
opinion?
No, I think saying it's just like that is not true, right? Because like white people are not like indigenous to the area, so yeah, it's not. I wouldn't say that that's a good like analogy.
I would argue that a lot of the people who are moving into Israel are not born in Israel. Would that be fair to say?
If you're not born there, does that mean you're not indigenous?
No, does it?
If I look up the definition of indigenous, it still means you're indigenous. Like if you're from like that nation or that ethnicity. So if like an indigenous person.
If I can trace my ancestry back to Israel, I am indigenous to Israel.
I think if you're a part of that group, then like the term indigenous would apply to it. I mean, if you have a problem with the concept of being indigenous, I think that that's totally valid. Like I can see that, but it does fit the definition of indigenous for sure.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Kenny. Next question. We're going to Spectre again because I know he's already asked a question, but we do practice mod supremacy on the server. So, Spectre, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Doobie. My question is, do you believe that Iran wants to destroy Israel? And if not, what did Ahmadinejad mean by wipe Israel off the map?
Yeah, I do believe Ahmadinejad wants to destroy Israel. When people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they often they think that the only people it used to be called an Arab-Israeli conflict. It's only recently we've started calling it an Israeli-Palestinian conflict because of the Gaza wars that have happened. But it's impossible to take out the neighboring Arab nations from the equation. And though I know technically Iranians aren't actually Arabs. But yeah, Iran does want to destroy Israel. Syria also wants to destroy Israel. Yeah, there are a lot of countries that still haven't recognized Israel's right to exist, even in the 1948 borders. So yeah, I understand the fear from their perspective, especially when you consider all the anti-Semitism that Ahmadinejad espouses.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Spectre. The next person we're going to is Neo. As soon as I can find him. Maybe I can find him. Maybe he's dead. That's okay. I'll go to someone else. The next question is gonna be from okay, it's gonna be from Gunley. Gunley, you are ready.
Why are you gay, woman? Why are you?
Okay, yeah, I was worried that would be the problem. So I guess Gunley wants to know why you're bisexual. If you'd like to answer that really quickly, that'd be okay.
I'm bisexual because I think hot people are hot. And yeah, I don't know, and they can come in different genders, and I guess it happens.
Okay. Thank you. That was beautiful. Next question is gonna be from let's go with this person. Question is from Duckers. What is your go-to example of the idea that people who would be considered horrible and cruel by our standards were kind by the standards of their time? There's a second question to follow up to this. That question is, would you worship the Shinto toilet god if they bless your bidet?
This has got to be one of my viewers.
Yeah, it is.
To the last question, yes. I honestly, any god that doesn't bless my bidet is like a weirdo. Like, it's very strange. What was the first question again? I got distracted by my bidet, thinking about my bidet.
That's weird. Okay. The question is, what is your go-to example of the idea that people who would be considered horrible and cruel by our standards were kind by the standards of their time?
Oh god, there's so many examples I could think of. Honestly, like, it's really important that you put on kind of, a good historical lens when, you're examining like a historical like subject matter. So when, when you're dealing with, say, like, the reason why I say the Nazis get dealt such a harsh, I guess, a harsh thing in history, you're probably thinking, oh, like, people have done like such shitty things in history, like, why are the Nazis regarded so badly? It's because the Nazis, they knew what they were doing was really wrong. Like, it was considered wrong by even the morals of the time. And we know that because they used code to talk whenever they gave one another orders. They had like little euphemisms for what they meant by killing. And like annihilating Jews. They purposely like hid what they meant. They even try to bomb and destroy like the gas chambers afterwards. Luckily they didn't destroy all of them, but to hide their work. And that's like why they get regarded so badly in history. But, other people who tend to not, recognize or they live in a society where they have, certain morals, that their morals are not so different than like, the world around them, we tend not to judge as harshly, like Genghis Khan or something like that. A good example I would think of is like Henry VIII. Though, I mean, having having 6 wives was particularly unique. The way we've regarded him and him kind of being demonized as like this huge villain is kind of strange. At the time, for a long time, he was revered, really as like one of the greatest kings England had ever had. He really was the king that took England out of being like this backwater, this irrelevant backwater, to starting to establish a navy that would later become the British Navy. And even like this whole idea of like divorce, like the idea that he just wanted to get rid of like a divorce. He just wanted to get rid of a wife and have a divorce, and that's why he wanted to do his and that's why he wanted to what's the word I'm looking for? Why he wanted to separate from the church. But that wasn't really to him, like, number one, it was totally rational at the time to be worried about having a son. Like, literally, at the time, I would have been sexist, right? We would have all been sexist because having a daughter was terrifying if you looked at, like, the history of the region and trying to end civil war of what was going on. So it was totally normal for him to be concerned about having a son, regardless of, women's rights and all of that stuff. And number two, it was also really normal to put away your wives. People did it all the time. Like, there's a reason why Shakespeare said, get thee to a nunnery. Like, when a wife wasn't doing her duty, she would, get put away in like a nunnery, or they'd have an annulment or something like that. Like, Henry VIII wasn't the first Catholic to get divorced. The Catholics just called it annulment instead. It was a totally normal thing that monarchs would do all the time. And it's, yeah, so like at the time, no one really judged him that harshly for it. The main reason why he got in so much trouble with the Pope about it was because the Pope happened to be under the control he had just been defeated in war by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And Charles V happens to be the nephew of the wife that Henry VIII is trying to divorce. So what it really meant was Henry VIII was concerned about an imperial power having control over his own personal issues. So that's the only reason why the Pope even rejected it. So yeah, I guess that would be an example. I don't know if that fits the question. But there are just so many that there's so many instances of that shit.
Okay. Next question is from Pro Slavery Gang. You are unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's up, Doobie? Thank you for finally finding me, by the way. I guess the question that I have is, I think we would assume that the intentions of Hamas is to engage in asymmetric warfare like the IRA and make war unpalatable to the Israelis they pull out. Do you think that they'll actually be able to achieve that goal? Or do you think what they're doing is ultimately futile because they can't really make the Holocaust look like a love tap? So I doubt they're going to make war unpalatable to the Israeli population.
Yeah, well, this is why I think Hamas is so ineffective. Like, with their goals, they're trying to use similar tactics, I guess, that were used, or at least like a similar structure, that were used against other colonial governments, in order, because you have to understand that the nature of colonialism, historically was always a capitalist, financial drive. So if the group there made it financially unviable or not useful, the ruling power, the colonial power would pull out. The problem is with something like when you're dealing with Israelis, even if you regard them as a colonial power, they don't see themselves as that. Right? They see themselves as completely indigenous to the land. So whether or not you agree that that's true, right, it's important to recognize, to take into the equation. And it's why those tactics are just never going to be effective, because even if it's totally financially unviable to be staying in the region, Jews are still going to stay in the region. Israelis are still going to stay in the region and still going to protect it. So they're not going to actually end up doing anything. It's not effective. All it does is it further radicalizes Israelis and makes Israelis less likely to want to pull out of the West Bank and the blockades on Gaza, because they're just more worried about their security issues, and then Palestinians get oppressed more.
Yeah, I think that you would also agree that it's definitely the case that Hamas is happier to have the average Palestinian suffering rather than they would actually having the Israelis pull out, right? Because I don't really see your average leader of Hamas being one of these people whose kids are carried into these buildings. I would assume, given the nature of what they do, you're not going to have the head of the snake living somewhere where he's likely to be bombed. So most of the people that actually suffer are not high-ranking officials within their command structure. It's just going to be ordinary people. So would you agree that if most people want to make the argument that Israel is evil because of the acts that they do, would you also say that in order for them to be consistent, they would have to condemn the leaders of Hamas who knowingly bring down this retaliatory action against innocent Palestinians who don't do anything, and it's really the people that are within their command structure that cause these kinds of issues?
I don't know. The problem with it depends on who's criticizing. If you're talking about leftists, right? The type of leftists who are being critical of Israel in this situation, they're always one of the bias I've noticed with leftists, especially with modern day leftists, where they see everything in power structures. They automatically see the people with lesser power as the ones who are morally good, and the people with more power as morally bad, in like those kind of simplistic terms. Like right wingers can do their own thing just in a different way. But could you repeat the main part of your question?
I think that in order for you to be consistent, right, with this claim that they're making that both sides are evil, if you take the position that the Israelis are evil for engaging in retaliatory strikes whenever Hamas decides to throw bottle rockets at them, you would also agree that the people within the command structure of Hamas are equally just as evil, knowing full well that the outcome of their actions, right?
Yeah, that's why. But I don't think if you automatically see the way things the way I described, and you see the world in that kind of like simplistic view, it's never going to work, right? Because it doesn't matter how genocidal Hamas is and its intention. It's always going to be regarded as Hamas is less powerful than Israel, therefore it is more morally in the right than Israel. And it's just such a problematic.
It's kind of dumb. It's like,
yeah, it's a very childlike view.
If I know fully well, like it's like Doobie going into a fight with me, right? Doobie knows that I'd like snap him into like a twig.
I
so
don't know about that.
If Doobie were to like backhand me, and I were to like turn around and like I guess curb stomp him, I would be perfectly justified in doing so. But like I wouldn't consider myself to be the bad guy because I've acted in self-defense to a perceived threat, right? So I don't see. Obviously, I understand like it's the messy details of them like coming in and like doing the occupation, etc., etc. But all things considered equal, I think they're fully aware of the actions that like they can't actually inflict the kind of damage that they want to do on Israel. So I would say, given the fact that they know that they're ineffective, I would make the argument that they're actually worse than the Israelis because you wouldn't really want to take the boot off your throat. Your boot off the throat of someone.
I do think Hamas is worse than the Israelis. I just don't think Hamas represents the Palestinian people. Even if they vote for Hamas, I understand why they vote for Hamas because Fatah fucking sucks and it's corrupt and Hamas is the only one that helps them, but like they might just be voting for Hamas because they just don't have a good alternative. So I don't see the Palestinians as being representative of Hamas. So like I don't so even though I hate Hamas with like a passion, I think they're gross and I wish they would get destroyed, I don't see the Palestinians as like the same group, especially specifically because they get oppressed by Hamas too. So yeah, like I just think it's really unfair really unfair, especially when you think of how many high rates of like children that have been killed in Gaza, especially in like the most recent war. I forget the exact number, but it was kind of crazy. Those children never got really a chance whether or not they're gonna vote for Hamas or not. So yeah, they shouldn't have to be like paying for the crimes of like this strong regime and all that stuff. The same way that I don't think Israeli civilians should be paying for the crimes of like Netanyahu.
I guess one final question then. Do you think the Hamas or like the Israeli, I guess, liberation or like, whatever you want to call it would be more effective if they were to completely demilitarize and seek a diplomatic solution by appealing to, I guess, like humanitarian aid? Because if you say,
yes.
Oh, by the way, we're not going to throw bottle rockets and like engage in suicide attacks, by the way, they are kind of like fucking us over, can you tell them to stop please, would be more effective than what they're doing right now?
Yes, because the entire reason, the excuses, the reasons why Palestinians get oppressed is out of fear from the Israelis. For example, the wall is very notorious. It's often called like the apartheid wall or something like that. That divides like Gaza and Israel. Sorry, not Gaza, West Bank. But the wall was built as a result of the terrorist attacks during the Second Intifada, and it was very effective in stopping the terrorist attacks. I think it reduced them by like 95% or something. So a lot of these, while the wall oppresses Palestinians, it protects Israelis. The wall wouldn't have to be there if Israelis were not worried about Palestinian militants, particularly funded by Hamas. So this is why I think it's so important to support Fatah and Fatah's efforts with the Palestinians, and try to at least reform Fatah and make it less corrupt and make it more effective for the Palestinians. Because they've gone the peaceful route, and that's the route that's actually going to end up helping Palestinians. And it's unfair. It's unfortunate because right now Fatah is very unpopular because, you know, they've got corruption issues and Mahmoud Abbas has somehow stayed in power for a very long time past his due date and all that stuff. But the biggest reason why they're unpopular is because they're seen as ineffective. And this is one of the shitty things with the peace process is that, like, war and being, you know, it's easy to shoot a rocket and be like, oh, well, look, we killed this amount of Israelis or something, or we cost Israel this amount of money. So we're very effective. And whereas like the more long-term peace allocations that have been made by Fatah, they're not as, you know, they're not as quick. So it just doesn't, so Fatah ends up in a situation where they're less able to say, oh, we've been really, really effective. But I think in the long term, they are the most effective. As a whole, you will find that if Palestinians are not, you know, if Israelis are not afraid of Palestinians, Palestinians, I think, would get a state basically, boom, like that. In the future, I don't know if that's possible, especially with how strong the Israeli right wing, like religious wing, is growing in population. They tend to have more sex. They tend to have more babies. I don't know if they're having more sex. But so that's a real problem. So in the future, that's really scary. But in like
people having more sex or more babies?
No. In the future, like them, as their population really, really grows and if they become the majority of Israel, then I think that's kind of like the end of a Palestinian dream. But for now, there's still a lot of time before that kind of thing happens. And it's still possible. Like the majority of Israelis still vote purely based on anxiety about rockets and security. And as long as that's the reason why they're oppressing Palestinians, that means that there's hope to potentially fix the situation.
Okay, one last question. Going by my name, pro-slavery man, would you keep Doobie as a slave?
Oh my god.
I don't think he would be an effective slave.
A good one. No.
Yeah, I don't think he would be an effective slave. He would take too much food for what he's worth.
What?
I mean, he did good job work.
Yeah, okay, fuck you guys. Viv, just to be clear, if we ever did fight, I'd have you in a dress serving me chai in like 2 minutes. Fuck you, Viv. Okay, next question. We're going to, who was it? Who really cares? That's a person's name. You are not muted, go for it.
I thought you were just asking everyone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Given the context that the Palestinians were and are a hostile people, examples of this include the Jaffa and Hebron massacres, which occurred in the 1920s, prior to the State of Israel, and the fact that all of Israel has belonged and does belong to the Jews. Jews were expelled from Israel by the Roman Empire, but never gave up on their hope to return to their land, Israel. How was the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948 not justified?
Wow. Okay. So you think that I think an ethnic cleansing is very rarely justified. And the only justification I could think of is in order to prevent literally a genocide, which is, I guess, worse. But that would depend on your own like moral axioms and all of that stuff. The thing is that like a lot of Palestinians actually trace their lineage back to the original Israelites too. Like genetically, they're often a very similar group. You have to understand that a lot of people in the region were forced to convert to Islam, or they intermingled and intermarried with the Arabs and all that stuff. So it's hard to say, like the people who are there right now who are Palestinians are amalgamation. And it's hard to say if they're not also indigenous to the land. So it would make no sense to me to just be going by this like arbitrary idea of like, you know, tracing Jewish from your mother, that they're the only people that are indigenous. Yeah, I don't, all that stuff. I don't know. I'm not used to meeting someone who has that perspective. If that's is that an honest like perspective of yours?
Well, totally yeah, I was alluding to the fact that they are hostile. So to ethnically cleanse them would be as a means to protect Israeli citizens. And listen, if Palestinians can, if some Palestinians can trace their lineage back to the ancient Israelites, I'd be totally fine with them living in Israel and being considered part of the Jewish state, but as a Jewish state and not as a Palestinian state.
Okay, but why can't Palestinians just have a state of their own?
Because it's all Jewish land. It was all of our land before we were expelled, before we were occupied by the Romans and then eventually expelled.
Okay, so do you genuinely think that what kind of land are you on right now? Are you American?
Yes.
Do you think someone should have a right to just like, an indigenous person has the right to come over there and kick you out of your home because it's their land, historically?
Well, that we would have to go into the history of why what happened to the Native Americans happened. That has to do with wars they fought against immigrants coming in, and that's a whole different conversation. But if it was their land, truly their land, then yeah, they would have a right to take their land back.
Yeah, the thing is that if you have this idea of who's, like, someone owns this land, before the Israelites, there were the Canaanites, and before the Canaanites took it over from a different region, right? There, as I mentioned, this area is being owned by so many different groups, like, who technically owns it? It's considered holy to so many different groups. So it feels, like, very strange to just decide to pick, like, one group that the entire land automatically like belongs to. The hostile argument is, I guess, a different argument, and so I guess I'll counter that with the Hebron massacre and the Jaffa massacre happened, but there were also tons of massacres that happened to Palestinians. There are villages where we have, actually, I don't know if I can even say this, but where just like a woman was was visibly tortured as she was raped by a bunch of Israeli soldiers. We have that from Israeli records. There's like a bunch of situations like that that happened. Do you think that kind of stuff is justified? Just because
no,
it's their land?
I don't think that's justified. But that was after the state of Israel. I'm talking about how prior to the state of Israel, the Palestinian population was hostile to the influx of Eastern European Jews coming in, immigrating, and they were targeting.
Not all Palestinians were hostile. Right, you have to understand at the time there wasn't a concept of being Palestinian. There was multiple villages, and all these villages had their own unique identities and their own structures. They were basically living in like a feudal system.
Palestinian nationalism came around in '67 with Arafat and the PLO, but
yeah, but then isn't it unfair to judge like the majority of the violence that that occurred was from like maybe like, I don't know, a few specific Palestinian groups or maybe the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. But why does it make sense to just like collectively punish an entire group assuming they're all going to think the same way? Especially when Palestinians are so diverse. There's Christian Palestinians, Sunni Palestinians, Shiite.
They all did. Most of them did. Most of them were supportive of what was going on. They threw their support to the Arab nations, the Arab neighbors of Israel, which attacked Israel on the War of Independence. They were supportive of that.
Maybe I don't think that's true. Most of them were not. Honestly, most of them didn't even realize. Like, most of them were living in kind of like working farms, living in like a feudal system. They were not really concerned about like the ins and outs of politics going on in like the big cities. So I don't know, like if you could find me like evidence that they all like supported it and stuff, but yeah, I don't know. This I'm kind of like, I haven't heard this kind of line of, I've met a lot of people who are like very right wing with Israeli stuff, but yeah, you're probably the most right wing I've met, like with this kind of
this is more in line with Mayor Kahana's ideology.
Yeah, you take the cake. You're more right-wing than Netanyahu. It's like an achievement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Who Really Cares.
Oh,
we appreciate
thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
Okay. Next question is from Pan. Oh, it's Pro-Israel Pan. That's the name. Pan, you are unmuted.
Eris, can you check AMA discussion?
Sure. And what am I supposed to be looking at?
I think Doobie really likes you.
I don't know what you're talking about at all.
Doobie, come on, you've been like simping the whole time.
No, I haven't. Fuck you.
Doobie, come on.
Okay, thank you for that. Goodbye. Thank you. Okay, next question.
I'm so confused.
Next question. That is going to be from let's go with this person. Become ungovernable. You're next. Go.
Yes. Woo.
Be civil, please.
I am civil. Right, hello friends. I have a question.
Wait, I couldn't hear
Ready
you.
to hear me ask my question?
Yeah, we can barely hear you.
What? You can barely hear me. Is that the problem?
Yeah, speak up a little bit.
Is there a problem with my volume?
That's a little better.
Right, I have a question.
Go on.
I'm gonna ask my question, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Right, here's my question. But one sec, I actually don't have a question.
Okay, you're a jackass. Okay, we're moving on. To CEO of Shitron, make GME great again. Whenever you're ready, mister.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yes. So I wanted to ask you, so it's fine, like you can, you know, look through the history, you could have these kind of conversation as to who's what and who's not. But my question is, ever since 1947, ever since the Israelis fought this land, or fought for their land, they bled for the land. Don't you think they have the right, pretty much, to any time there's, you know, some kind of conflict, and these people are, you know, it's not free, right? It's literally Israeli people defending their land, and there's people's blood in these conflicts. Do you not believe that, you know, I know it's just kind of a weird word, but like compensation-wise, or just some way, Israel should have some more stake in the land the more times there are violent conflicts that occur with Israel and Palestine, you know?
It's a strange argument, right? Because that argument could be used to delegitimize Israel too. So you could say that, like, if, for example, plenty of Egyptians bled for the land of Palestine and Israel, with how many times, you know, and how hard Egypt fought with Israel during the, you know, the 1948 war, the 1967 war, etc., right? So I don't know, like, then what does that mean, that Egypt gets a claim on Israel? But that seems kind of strange, that like the amount of blood that's given. I don't know.
Would you not agree to a certain extent might is right? Right, and like regardless of how all the moral panderings you want to do, all the philosophical discussion of who's right, who's wrong, right? At the end of the day, who owns the land is the people that could flex their muscle the hardest. They get the say in what occurs and
like
what happens.
Survival of the fittest?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, well, I don't like that, because at the same time that also
we have
justifies
seen consistently Israel dominates.
I don't know if this is like a real opinion, right? But if you believe in like the might is right thing, I disagree. But I'm not a political theorist or like an ethics, you know, master or anything. So it seems like that seems just instinctively, that seems like kind of weird to me, especially as humans, where we have the ability to be like compassionate and concerned and all of that stuff. I mean, the Nazis were incredibly powerful, and they had, you know, the guns, the power to make Jews walk into gas chambers. Does that mean that justifies their actions? Like, I don't think that we want to live in a society where might is right. That just leads to a really shitty world.
Mr. Jamie.
I convinced him. That's it. Okay,
Yeah,
let's move
I
on.
think he's dead. So we're coming up to that 2-hour point. And Eris, we talked about this being about 2 hours. You okay with taking like 5 more questions? And
Yeah, I
wrapping
don't
it
mind
up?
going a little longer.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask most of these questions myself. So if you'd like to ask a question, just spam it in the AMA questions channel, and I'll pick it out at random. Okay. First question is gonna be from the typing. They're typing. Okay, it's gonna be for Ratmanaj. What do you think of the latest news about Naftali Bennett agreeing with Yair Lapid? I don't really know how to say that name.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to continue the question. I'm very happy about it. I'm kind of surprised. But I'm not going to believe that Netanyahu's like with Trump. I'm not going to believe that Netanyahu's officially out of office until he's like literally let out. And so I'm still a little skeptical. Still a little skeptical of it. But
Okay.
I'm very happy at the news.
Next question: are you satisfied with Biden's handling of the situation? Do you think he's been holding Israel accountable?
Okay, the problem is that if there was someone who has the power, someone that I would trust to do something great about the situation, it is Biden. I feel like he's demonstrated himself, like especially since he's come into office. And mostly what I really like about him is who he puts in power, and he's really good at like going for like expertise and all of that stuff. And especially when you're talking about foreign aid and diplomacy, that's really, really, really important. It's hard to say, like all the stuff that you hear on the outside, like, oh, we're going to be tough on Israel, or we're going to be tough on terrorism, or, Israel's our friend, like all that shit. It's just like, it's just political posturing, and none of it's like what's actually happening at the negotiation table. So I don't give a shit at all what he says on the outside, because what he says on the outside is what he needs to say diplomatically. It's what he needs to say for his constituents. It's what he needs to say politically. What I care about is what he's saying at that diplomacy table, and I'm only going to find out what he said there, maybe in like 20 years or maybe a little earlier. We found out we found out pretty early what happened at the diplomacy table because Hillary Clinton wrote her book Hard Choices, and she had a whole chapter dedicated to the discussion of the ceasefire during, I think, the 2008 Gaza crisis. There was another one in 2012, but I think it's 2008. So I mean, maybe if he releases a book or something, we'll find out the details of like what happened, like with her, and yeah, like. And people will often, if there's something that I've learned from history, is that governments operate very differently privately than they do to the public with the politics. So for all we know, he was being incredibly tough on Israel, and for all we know, he was doing the exact opposite. For all we know, he was actually being really, really effective, like, and we're going to have peace and all that stuff. Or it's the exact opposite. So it's, yeah, I'm not really sure.
Okay. Next question is, are you an atheist? And if so, have you checked out modern orthodoxy?
I am. By modern orthodoxy, do they mean like modern Orthodox Judaism?
Yes.
Okay. I'm an agnostic atheist, but I'm very Jewish culturally. Like, I really like the culture. I really like, I like the history and the traditions and the moral philosophies and all of that stuff. But yeah, I would say I'm agnostic with my atheism because I don't believe a God doesn't exist or anything, and I actually have an instinct to believe like he does. I still pray on a regular basis, like especially when I'm in tough situations, just because I'm like, just in case, But I don't live my life like with this 100%. Yeah, he's there, like kind of knowledge. And I really hope that the God that I grew up learning about, I grew up in, I guess, like more traditional Orthodox Judaism, and the kind of God that I was taught about, that I read about in the Torah, was a very, very scary and abusive God, and that is not the kind of God that I would like to believe in. So, if that existed, in terms of modern Orthodoxy, I'm open to it. I really like a lot of the structure within Orthodox lifestyles. And it's something that I've tried to implement into my daily life. And there's always something that you really lose. So I often miss a lot of like the positive aspects of that kind of lifestyle. But at the same time, it's also very stressful, and always being worried about, did you follow like God's rule here? Did you follow God's rule here? Like, and all that stuff. Because when you're Orthodox, every little decision in your life is just ruled by, what's considered like halakha and like lawful. Even something as simple as, how long you wait to digest meat before you eat a dairy product. It's so meticulous and detailed. Like, to make your oven, when you move in, you have to make your oven, you have to literally put a lock on your oven for like 3 days or something to make it kosher. Like, there's a lot of shit like that that's like, I have a very hard time thinking that it's rational or like practical. But some of the stuff I really like I love like the idea of like a Sabbath and a day of rest. I think that's always like a good, like Judaism does self-care well, for that stuff.
Okay. Next question is from Freegy. How do you solve Palestinian and / Arab supporters' anti-Semitic attacks across the world and in Israel? How can you peacefully live with so many people that want to drive Jews into the sea?
I don't think they can peacefully live together, like for a while. Honestly, like the latest attacks, both the attacks on Arabs, and both the attacks and also the lynching of Jews in like Arab cities, like the mixed cities where all the violence was happening. And I would love to just be like a fucking hippie about it and be like, oh, like let's put them all together and let's let them all get along and it's gonna be great, just like a nice city in Canada, because in Canada, Arabs and Jews can live together in total peace and harmony, right? But it's a very different situation. It's a very, very different. And it's also a different type of population. It's different history. There's different land. It's like, it feels like almost the most European thing to do, to like say like, okay, I'm going to draw these arbitrary borders, right? Say like around modern day Palestine, and say, okay, all of you just automatically get along. It's not going to happen. Especially with, there's so much burnt bridges and animosity that's built in there. Almost everyone in Israel-Palestine has lost someone. Most Palestinians have lost multiple people. Most Israelis have lost at least one person. It's very hard to expect those people to just automatically turn off their trauma, and how much, because that trauma often leads to anger. The best thing that I could think of is that like they need to live separately and peacefully, side by side for a certain amount of time, and at least with non-violence, then they can become de-radicalized and potentially a little more similar, and then eventually meld into one population. But I think that needs to happen slowly, organically over time. Does that answer the question, or
Yeah, I think that answered the question.
Okay.
Next question is for me. So we've spoken a lot about Israel-Palestine today, obviously. But that isn't the only thing you do, right? On the internet, on Twitch, on Discord. So for the people who don't know who you are, can you maybe tell them like what sorts of things you're interested in? If they were to check out your stream this coming week, for example, what would they find? And for everybody who isn't aware, that stream is linked above this channel, but also it's pinned in the discussion channel and the end of the announcements. And she's currently streaming, and I don't think she'll stop streaming when the segment is over. So, Eris, like, what should they look forward to if they were to check out your channel going forward?
I guess like my stream is always very history focused, but I also I love making people laugh and being really stupid sometimes. So that's like a lot of the stream is a lot of like trolling and history jokes and like all that stuff, because a lot of the content that we deal with is very, very hard. like for this week, for example, we'll be focusing on learning about the genocides of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And I know you probably hear these terms all the time, like genocide, colonialism, apartheid, all this stuff. And like, I think it's much more helpful, instead of getting into like those terms, to get into like literally what happened. Like, let's talk about in detail. Like, let's look at that primary document. Let's talk about what happened in this village, and I want to tell that story. And I always try to be really, really responsible, making sure that I'm going with historical consensus, like what's the consensus amongst scholars and all that stuff, not going with like just completely fringe views. If I do say a fringe view, I make sure to be really open and transparent about that. I don't like telling people how to think. Something I'm so proud of with my community is that we are so politically diverse. Like, we all have like crazy opinions from one end to the other. Everyone just loves history and loves, adding historical context to their current political opinions to make them, more polished. And I think historical context it makes everything so much easier, and it just makes you so much more likely to have a more accurate, I guess, political opinion, regardless of what your moral axioms are and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, because we deal with really intense shit like that, I try to also do lighthearted stuff, and sometimes we get a little inappropriate, with some of our jokes. Yeah, but it's always a good time. So you're gonna learn, and you're gonna laugh. And if you just wanna insult me and hear me talk about how I'm sexually repressed or something, I'll do that too. But yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I stream every day at 2 p.m. And you should definitely check it out.
What time zone?
Eastern, 2 p.m. Eastern.
Thank you, Miles. Last question. So, if there was a person who, let's say they had a massive crush on you, and they'd been harboring this crush for a long time,
oh no,
and they'd been trying out all the high school tricks, negging, insulting, pulling your hair, being mean to you just generally, and it didn't seem to be working, right? What would be a good strategy for getting your attention romantically be? Should they I don't know, should they buy a glass of wine? Should they asking for a friend to chat? Fuck you guys. What would what would a good strategy be?
I think probably solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would help. Creating peace in the Middle East, that would be a really good start. And maybe donating to my streams sometimes, so I can, eat a third meal in a day sometimes. That'd be nice.
Okay. Well, thank you for visiting us. For those of you who are interested in watching the rest of Eris' stream, you'll still find those links. Eris, do you have anything else you want to say before we cut it off?
Nothing. I'm kind of surprised I didn't get more criticism of Israel here. I don't know. That was kind of
weird,
surprising.
right? So this isn't a fucking Nazi server, like I've been telling you forever.
Well, I don't think anyone who criticizes Israel is a Nazi. I thought there would be more
lefty
criticisms.
You thought you'd be flooded with
no one here
anti-Semites
wanted
and
to
Nazis.
talk about apartheid or anything. It's I had a whole sentence prepared.
Do you want to talk about apartheid? I think Charm will sit here. Okay.
Okay. If you have a few other questions, I don't mind answering a few more, but if they're good ones, but I don't know.
Okay, Chum, I'm gonna unmute you so you can ask your question yourself because it's very complicated. We're going to the lightning round, okay?
Okay. Can I be heard? Just testing. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I guess there's a couple of things you said that I took issue with. So I'm just gonna ask this as a combo question. You can take notes on whatever, because it's gonna be a couple of different things, and you can just respond to whatever you like. Okay, so part one. Have you seen the DNA testing which shows modern-day Palestinians are descendants of modern Lebanese? Part two, do you think that, how do you think that criticism BDS itself could radicalize Israelis independent of fearmongers using it for that purpose. Isn't this the same as taking the position that there's no acceptable form of protest, as with Kaepernick? Part 3, have you seen the 2017 Hamas Charter, which does not mention the abolition of Israel, but specifically fight against Zionism? Part 4, how can calling it apartheid be extreme right now when both Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem both have both major dominant human rights organizations? And then part 5, and this was my original question, do you think given the Vihia Doctrine, Begin Doctrine, Samson Protocol, etc., references to murdering Palestinians such as mowing the grass, calling them rodents, calling them a cancer, even among the general population, and deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, do you think that Israel should still be allowed to make decisions and impose military rule over Palestinian life, use weapons, etc.? And that's why I just said you can respond to whatever you like, because there was a lot there.
The Hamas one, I'll quickly respond to. So the charter that they released in 2017 is not actually a replacement for their original charter. You can look this up, fact check me, all of that stuff. It's not. It was just a PR move. It's not their real charter. There is a reformist movement within Hamas that they are trying to reform Hamas and get rid of the old charter. But so far, all the current leaders literally say that they are following the old original charter, and it is still their current charter. So it was just a weird PR move. And additionally, all the leaders of Hamas have just even this year said incredibly anti-Semitic things. So to me, it's not even a debate whether or not they are anti-Semitic as an organization. And the fact that they literally rejected reformers within their own movement to try to move away from the anti-Semitism just makes it even worse to me. There's so many fucking questions. What was the first question again?
Sorry about that.
Okay.
First one, DNA testing showing that Palestinians are modern-day descendants of the modern-day Lebanese.
Yeah, I've seen that DNA testing demonstrates that they're that the entire region of Arabs in Jordan and southern Lebanese are they're an amalgamation of different racial groups and all of that stuff. Again, some of them are actually racially similar to Jews as well. So I don't know. They're more similar to Ashkenazi Jews than Ashkenazi Jews are to other Europeans. So I've seen a lot of mixed stuff. I think we're only going to find out for sure probably in the next 20, 30 years, as more and more people get their genetics tested. But yeah, I don't know if it would change anything for me either way. What was the other question?
I asked about BDS. That was one of them.
Oh, okay,
How do you
BDS.
feel that-
I don't have a problem with the idea of boycotting Israel. The issues I've had is with the organization of BDS, because BDS doesn't seek to end the occupation. It seeks to completely delegitimize Israel as a whole and wipe Israel off the map. So by supporting it, it's directly going against the peace process. And so it plays basically into Netanyahu's hands, because then they could say, oh, all boycotts are basically about, they're not about reducing the harm to Palestinians, they're about literally wiping us off the map. So if BDS stopped doing that and started being very focused on the occupation, they apologized for their earlier remarks, they officially recognized Israel, even just 1948 borders would be fine. And then that means that at least they support the peace process. And maybe that then I would be more inclined to support them. There are also a lot of their leaders have had a really nasty history with anti-Semitism. And I can tell you that BDS movements on campus as a whole are usually feared by Jewish communities, because they have a tendency to target Jewish organizations or Jewish groups and not just Israelis, or representatives of the Israeli government or something, which make it to Jews feel like it's an anti-Semitic organization and that they target Israel because it's a Jewish state rather than actually caring about what it's doing to Palestinians. So I think it's totally fine to boycott countries that you disagree with. I think Israel does a lot of nasty shit that deserves to get boycotted. And especially when it breaks international law and it diminishes. I think Israel should be punished also, like when it doesn't follow the peace process, which is every single time they build a settlement. So I wish that I wish there would be more, I guess. I wish like BDS would be focused on ending settlements. Like if you really care about Palestinians right now, the number one thing that you should be focused on, regardless, even if you hate Israel, even if you want Israel totally wiped off the map, you think it's totally legitimate, all of that shit. But if you really care about Palestinians, like you care about Palestinians more than anything else, you will be focused 100% on ending settlements. Because every single time Israel builds another settlement in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, it makes it less and less likely that Palestinians are ever going to get their own state, because you end up in a situation where the only way for Palestinians to get their own state is to just fully ethnically cleanse all those regions of Jews. And the more they live there, the longer they live there, the more they become cemented there. So and that means it's less likely going to happen. So you should be focused, like everyone here who gives a shit about Palestinians should be focused on ending those settlements, because that is a practical thing that you can actually help Israel change and push for them to change. And I just wish if BDS actually focused on that, then I would totally support them. But because they basically are just doing this kind of like moral posturing of trying to erase Israel off the map, and Israel has nukes, it's not going to get off the map. It just comes off like, a useless organization to me that cares more about just hating Israel than helping Palestinians.
All right, thanks. Well, when you say that, it makes me think of like the people that are like, well, Black Lives Matter doesn't really care about black people because they haven't like built neighborhoods or whatever. But okay, thank you for at least addressing the question.
Yeah, I don't think that's a fair analogy, but
Okay.
Any other questions?
So, I think there's one more person, Charmel, who I was actually kind of avoiding, to be honest with you, because he's kind of a dickhead. But before we move on, to Charmel, who is a dickhead, I would just like to, just let you know that I've donated about 35 gift subs in the last 10 minutes or so. So. Just FYI.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. So, Charm, whenever you're ready.
Hello.
Hey, Charm.
Wow. Hello.
Hi, Iris. It's so fun to be here. And we don't like to be called dickheads. We prefer pee-pee noggins. Thank you very much. All right. Anyway,
be nice, please. Okay.
No, of course. Nice to my queen. Hello. Duh. I kneel. So, few things. I just want to roll through these real quick. You can just answer them real fast. If you can't answer it, that's fine. We'll just go through it. How isn't Hamas just Palestine's military? I think you kind of touched on that. Especially because it's not. You said. I guess my biggest thing.
Its entire structure is genocidal, right? Like they target civilians rather than targeting the IDF. Or they don't target politicians. They don't target political buildings. They target civilian zones, heavily populated civilian zones.
But as opposed to what else do they have? You know what I mean? I just don't understand. There's nothing else, right? Because it is. You said it's not quite an apartheid state, but it's very close to an apartheid state.
I wouldn't say it's close. I'd say that it's in danger of becoming an apartheid state. I think in some ways the situation with Palestinians is worse than apartheid. So I just don't think that apartheid's a good analogy to describe what's going on.
Okay, yeah. So because of that, right? Then isn't Hamas and Bibi isn't Hamas Bibi's biggest ally then? Because as you said before,
I would say that they work hand in hand. They don't realize it, but they do. They do realize it.
While we're in this political off season for the USA, isn't it kind of this feels just every time Hamas shoots rockets, it kind of feels like an ad for Raid Shadow Legends, right?
But for
hey everybody,
Netanyahu.
we have to talk about this now. Hey everybody, we got to talk about don't forget about Panama. Who cares about South American trade? Let's talk about Israel's trade and like why it's so important to move product and eyeballs and ears and propaganda through there, right? Because I mean, honestly, it's been like 3 weeks now we've talked about this.
Mm-hmm. So you think that like Hamas? My big self. You think that Hamas like targets Israeli civilians in order to create a big ruckus, so that attention gets brought to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is that like?
Hey, your words. I mean, that sounds like. I just want.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that that's a factor, right? I'm sure that's how they
like,
justify it to themselves.
Right. Well, I mean, it trends, right? Like the reason why everybody hates Twitter is because Twitter keeps being a thing, right? So the moment like something big happens, that's what they want. And this is always like, that's something big, like, so I just, every time.
Yeah, but the world getting mad at Israel or Twitter getting mad at Israel means very, very little. In terms of like practicality.
Dominating the American news cycle for like 3 weeks. I think that's pretty, like, I don't understand how that's not big in like the AdSense kind of way. You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, it could help it could help at least like with pressuring Israel to do some things, but I feel like there are plenty of other ways you could be doing that. I mean, like hunger strikes or big protests. I mean, the protests got a lot of attention. Honestly, like I'm a huge fan of film. Like I think a movie would be really good. Like we've never had a movie about the Palestinian struggle. I think that would be an excellent way. Like there's so many ways that I could think of that could really help the Palestinian cause that doesn't involve war crimes and targeting and genociding Jews.
Well, it's funny you mention that because there was a fairly popular streamer just got banned off Twitch because Infrared, I think was his name, because he was posting Amy's documentary about Palestine, and they said no, that like somehow I guess breaks TOS, or he got reported, and he was banned for 30 days for showing that movie.
Whose documentary?
I forget her name. I don't know if Chad can help out. It's Amy something. She has a documentary on Palestine.
I know who you're talking about. And she's the beat on RT.
Sorry, her name escapes me. But
yeah, it's escaping me right now. I know who you're talking about though. A few streamers have pushed that. That documentary is actually kind of gross. Like she is Abby Martin. That's who it is. She is just selling propaganda. She is just pushing propaganda to people. It's very similar to the Zionist propaganda I grew up with listening to, just on the other side. It's not that documentary is filled with slow motion videos of Palestinian suffering, and the most it feels like what's that word, like when you're taking advantage of someone's suffering in like this really grandiose, offensive way.
Schadenfreude?
I guess it's just like,
it's
kind of like suffer porn, effectively.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. Suffering porn. It's just kind of gross. I've seen it, and it also has a lot of lies in it, like a lot. And it's not surprising because I mean this is coming from a woman who is has no actual academic credentials. She regularly lies on she's believed in conspiracy theories historically, and only recently I think realized that 9/11 wasn't done by it wasn't an inside job. So she's not exactly a credible source. If you want credible sources that are very, very critical of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or very critical of the Israeli government and its actions, you can go to a historian named Elon Pape. You can he's written a book called, I think, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's a pretty good source. Some issues with it, right? But there's plenty of good people to go to for criticisms of Israel that, trust me, do not treat Israel with kid gloves. But it doesn't mean that you need to go to someone vile like the stuff that she reports. And I've been kind of disappointed seeing streamers push her. Even though just because they agree with like
you just said there needs to be a movie, but then regardless of what she believes, her video was of them suffering, right? Like that is real, though, right? Like
Yeah, but
because,
it's a
as far as, like,
documentary, and documentaries are supposed to be truthful, and it's just a propagandist thing.
how is the video not truthful? I don't understand.
But it lies regularly. It lied about Hamas's charter. It lied about a bunch of actions. That it lied about Hamas's oppression of Palestinians. It lied regularly. I'm actually planning on doing like a whole YouTube takedown video, of that documentary. So
Okay,
yeah,
so
that'd be really
stay
interesting.
tuned for that one, maybe.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. Thanks. And just real quick, also, what do you know of extra geopolitical powers that are currently funding this conflict?
What?
Like, obviously, we know U.S. is on side, but is there anybody we might not know about who's like rooting for Palestine or?
I mean, the Arab world as a whole roots for Palestine on average. I think like Russia and China are somewhat allies, and Pakistan is somewhat of an ally too. But it's one of the reasons why like the UN can be a little biased. But I don't know. Like I'm not too knowledgeable on like the intricacies of like the geopolitical world. At least in the modern age. I know it historically, but not with what's technically going on right now.
Well, thank you so much, Eris. You're so knowledgeable. You're
Just
so
after I said I don't know about
smart.
something, but thank you.
Yeah, I'm aware. No, but no, seriously, thank you for everything you do. It's awesome. And oh shit. Do you think there's a Holocaust of the poor going on in the USA right now?
I do not
Is
know
that
enough
too
about.
far, or?
I do not know enough about that to say yes or
Okay.
no.
I had that back in my head too. All right, well, thank you again, Eris. Are you single?
Okay.
Oh,
so
no comment.
really quickly. So just FYI, I made a Charmel. Just want to let you know why I think Charmel's a dickhead. Charm was speaking to a rape survivor, and he told this person that the reason he doesn't like rap is because he was raped by a black man. Charm is a massive dickhead. Everybody should know this, and Charm, you owe that person an apology. Okay. Eris,
Wow. Okay.
thank you so much for coming for the AMA. And you're a very intelligent person. I think everybody here should check her out on Twitch. And
Thank you.
yeah, just FYI, I did donate 35 subs. So, and prior to this, I've donated hundreds and hundreds of dollars to your channel.
I think
just saying.
I think I still need about 45 more to reach my goal though. So. No.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming, guys. Please check her out on Twitch. Channels in the announcements.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Nope. I think we're all done. Thank you, Eris.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. And yeah, it was cool not to get random anti-Semitic attack. That was very nice.
Okay. Well, talk to you later. Have a good stream.
Woo, my first AME, guys. What did you guys think?